And now to introduce our 2 o'clock Interfaith Lecture Series, and a very special program today here in the Hall of Philosophy, where this week we're presenting the theme, Celebrating the Genius and Soul of the Nation. Our distinguished guests today are Dr. Barbara Williams Skinner and Dr. Doug Birdsall. Dr. Barbara Williams Skinner has made an indelible imprint in American public policy, government, diversity, and community relations. She has a long history of building bridges and advancing the inclusion of people of all cultures in both the private and public sector with organizations like Toyota and GE. Born in Richmond, California, she began her career serving as a senior congressional staff member and became the first female executive director of the Congressional Black Caucus. She continues to serve as advisor to CBC members and to the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation. She's currently CEO of Skinner Leadership Institute, specializing in networking, bridge building, and leadership development opportunities between congressional leaders, business executives, diverse groups, college students, faith leaders, young professionals, and urban youth. Dr. William Skinner is considered one of Washington's most influential leaders and is included in the 2008 Presidential Who's Who among business and professional achievers. Dr. William Skinner holds a BA in social welfare from San Francisco State University, a Master of Social Work and a Juris Doctorate from UCLA, and a Master of Divinity and Doctorate of Ministry from Howard University School of Divinity. She served on the White House Faith Council and has worked for over 30 years in close partnership with high-level leaders of diverse backgrounds across the nation to find common ground for strengthening all communities. I met Barbara over 25 years ago, and we've worked closely on many projects, and we are all grateful that she is working on Capitol Hill to build bridges. Dr. S. Douglas Birdsall, PhD, is a Presbyterian minister who spent most of his 37-year career in the global mission of the church. In 1980, Doug and his wife, Janine, began their service in Japan, where they served for 24 years. In 2004, Doug was appointed executive chairman of the Lausanne movement, and he led the revitalization of the movement, culminating in the third Lausanne Congress on World Evangelization, held in Cape Town in 2010. That Congress brought together 4,200 Christian leaders from 198 nations to consider the challenges and opportunities before the church with respect to global mission in the 21st century. After completing his service with the Lausanne movement, he was appointed to serve as the 27th president of the American Bible Society. In 2015, Doug Birdsall founded the work Civilitas with a vision to bring convicted Christian civility to our increasingly uncivil society. Much of the work of Civilitas is focused on the work of racial reconciliation through an initiative called After Charleston, Overcoming Evil with Good. Doug is a graduate of Wheaton College, Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, Harvard University, and the Oxford Center for Mission Studies. The Birdsalls live in South Hamilton, Massachusetts, and their 3 children live in New York, London, and Cambridge. Doug is joined today by his wife, Janine. I'd ask Janine if you would stand so that we can acknowledge you, and we're grateful for your presence. We're most grateful to the Gertrude Elser Schroeder Fund for providing support for this week's Interfaith Lecture Series. Some of you know the words of Shakespeare in the Twelfth Night. Some are born great, some achieve greatness, and some have greatness thrust upon them. And that's my feeling about our 2 speakers today who've been friends for some time. Greatness thrust upon them at a time of national crisis, at a time of widening chasms and divides in American public life. These 2 leaders have emerged from very different backgrounds and walks of life to work together to try to heal and lead racial and economic reconciliation. So we're grateful that they have accepted the mantle and call to greatness. So today we will hear from each of our speakers briefly, and then we'll turn to a brief dialogue between them. But then the third component, when we open the floor for questions and answers, I want to pose an interactive exercise question for our Chautauqua audience. As you hear them reflect and talk on issues of racial equality, fact or fiction, I ask you to reflect on your own community, neighborhood, city, town, and be prepared to report on what worries you most about the future of your community or of our nation, and what gives you hope. So I hope there will be a long line of people standing here to offer very brief reports on what gives us hope and what worries us most as we look into the future. And I think that kind of reporting from Chautauquans from across the land will be useful input for these two leaders who continue to lead an important conversation in the nation. Well, with that, we're delighted that Barbara and Doug are with us today, and I ask you now to join me in providing a very warm Chautauqua welcome to our guests.
I'd like to. Thank you very much.
Thank you. First of all, let me confess one thing. I have been failing at bringing the Congress together. I've not done my job, Robert. Let me also thank Robert, who I've known for so many years, Dr. Robert Franklin, for inviting me here 90 miles from the nearest sin. It's just a beautiful, really incredible place. I'm grateful to the Brookmans, Maggie and Bill, for incredible hospitality. But I do want to make a confession today, because when you read all of those degrees, you think, here's an expert. Let me just say this. I'm standing before you now as a woman who was one mother's prayer away from joining the Black Panther Party. So I'm a learner in this process along with you. So we can put this all into context. What I'd like to talk about today, this interesting 4th of July period where we talk about American values, is what the greatest threat is to our nation and our freedoms. I want to argue that the greatest threat to American democracy and freedom is not external. I was President Obama who so eloquently said on the 2015 anniversary, standing at the base of the Edmund Pettus Bridge with John Lewis, one of the freedom fighters and civil rights leaders at his side, who almost was killed by the Alabama police, that our union, this nation, our union, is not perfect. And so today, I want to talk about what that real threat is. I do admit that external threats are real. Yes, Russian hacking is real. That is real. You know, the specter of North Korea finally getting an intercontinental ballistic missile that can reach Alaska is real. I'm not diminishing that at the least, or nuclearize Iran or global cyber attacks. But I, as an American, have watched us for decades beat back every threat. I grew up in the age of communism, a global communism threat. That is not a threat anymore. The attack on Pearl Harbor, the Cuban Missile Crisis. I remember as a little girl sitting in the bed with my mother saying, we're about to blow up as a world. But our nation is so resilient, so amazing, that we have been able to deal with all of those and other crises. But let me suggest today that as with the Civil War fought over 150 years ago over slavery, that the greatest threat is this. It is the unresolved, unaddressed, unreconciled, unrepentant, unforgiven, and unrestituted enslavement of human bodies for profit. That's the problem. And it is the lingering psychic damage to both blacks and whites alike that I want to address, whether we want to admit it or not. And that threat is resulted in an underlying and unspoken philosophy that's borne out in practice, that non-white Americans Black Americans in particular might be free in the law, but not equal to white people. That is blasphemous. That is preposterous. Indeed, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., in his letter from a Birmingham jail, said, in a real sense, where all life is interrelated. He said that we're caught in an inescapable network of mutuality tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly, and that I can never be what I ought to be unless you are what you ought to be. And he calls this the interrelated structure of reality. Let me say again that the very notion that skin color, biological pigmentation, a factor created by God and not by humans, is of greater value if it's white than if it's black, ought to trouble us greatly. Trouble us greatly as human, on the human scale, as human people. And it also calls a lie, a core tenet of the Judeo-Christian ethic that all humans are created in the image of God, Imago Dei. And further, it contradicts what people of other faiths and those with no faith call the universal human dignity and worth. And denials notwithstanding, let me say to you today, as a very black woman, the spirit of the 224 years of American enslavement and dehumanization of people for profit, 100 years of legalized discrimination, and persistent today, 2017, systemic discrimination is alive and well. And let me talk about how it has taken root. How it has taken root. And I want to also confess that I could not have spoken to you 10 years ago because I was so angry I couldn't talk about it. But I thank God for the grace that He gives me to see us as connected on the planet, that I can share these thoughts with you. But it's taken root in the enduring assumption of white superiority and black inferiority, 224 years written into the law, is a spirit that lives on even in our languaging of white and black. White meaning purity and moral and lightness and rightness, and black meaning dangerous, discontent, negative, evil, hostile. It lives on in the basket of privileges given to whites over blacks in every sphere: wealth, housing, you name it, cultural, arts, education, even and especially in the criminal justice system. And it was alive and well through the entire presidency of Barack Obama, who most people thought, getting a black president, we ought to get over it. Yeah, no, we didn't get over it. We did not get over it. So here we are. Here we are. Over 200 years after enslaved Africans in America were counted, get this, 3/5 of a person in our own Constitution. After the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were enacted to guarantee both freedom and equality, and 50 years since the work of Dr. Martin Luther King, it's almost as though Dr. King never lived. And I'm not a cynic saying that. I'm saying that with a lament in my heart. Dr. Alex McCulloch of the Jesuit Social Research Institute was right when he said, these laws can be easily gotten around if the community for which they are intended does not fully accept them. To overcome discrimination, a community must interiorize the value that inspire just laws and live out in day-to-day life the conviction of equal dignity of all. So I want to say this again. Get over it and don't blame me. I didn't have slaves. It's not going to get us where we need to go toward racial healing. So stop it. Stop it. It doesn't help us get from here to there. I'm a decision maker and a bottom line person. I want to die knowing that my grandchildren, my 11 grandchildren, will not go through what my grandmother and great-grandmother went through. That's my hope. Even before the 2016 presidential election, the Southern Poverty Law Center reported an alarming rate in hate crimes against Jews, Hispanics, African Americans, immigrants, Muslims, including in elementary schools. Can you believe it? And this growing outbreak of violence is deeply rooted and will not be plucked out in the law. It has been plucked out in the heart. Though much progress, I confess, has been made. But this system of inequality is alive in at least two major areas. One, an equal justice system. For example, my heart goes out to those who are addicted to opioids. But I'm sorry. I'm sorry that we are now considering that a health crisis and we consider drug addiction of black people a crime. That's really what you have to say is fundamentally wrong in this whole equation. And in the disparities that I've talked about. And I want to suggest that no amount of finger pointing, and I'm not here for that. I'm here because this amazingly beautiful community, amazingly peaceful community, a community of intellectuals must wonder, how do we summon the intellect and the heart to deal with an issue that is not going to do any more than deepen? Let me talk about the real danger. Why do I call it a danger? First, it stains the very flag that flies all over our houses, where the guarantee of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is for all humans created by our God. It also forfeits the talent of all of God's people. I can't imagine that we would do better without a Charles Drew or a Carver or others who invented everything from blood plasma to automatic elevator doors to the fiber optics in our cell phones. But inequality surprisingly makes victims of poor and working class white people who have been lied to and told that people of color, immigrants, Muslims, Jews, and African Americans, non-white people in general, should be the target of their anger and the reason for their depressed economic plight. Nothing is further from the truth. But the ultimate danger is the tearing asunder of the very soul of our nation. The racial fear, mistrust, ignorance, and antagonism do not build bridges. They build impenetrable walls. And I believe it makes potential victims of all of us. In Dallas, a year ago, 5 white policemen shot and killed by an angry black man. A white man goes into a church in Charleston that brought my brother and I here together. Out of that, some of us just think these ideas, others are crazy enough to act them out. It makes us all it makes it very dangerous for all of us. So what do we do about this? Let me just say this, that 2 of the most quoted people on the planet, I want to suggest, are Abraham Lincoln and Alexa de Tocqueville. I don't think either one is qualified to talk to us about racial healing. Abraham Lincoln, so-called emancipator, in his 1858 U.S. Senate debate with Stephen Douglas, stated his views on the inequality of black people in America, and de Tocqueville called Native American savages. So I'm not all that loosey-goosey. I'm not really pumped up emotionally about those 2 guys. Instead, I want to look to a former slave and orator and abolitionist, Frederick Douglass, in his famous speech, "What to an African Slave is the 4th of July," who rightly reminds us that we must urgently, he says, urgently close the gap between the ideals of the United States and the reality we witness every day. So what then is our road from freedom to equality? Let me suggest a few things. First of all, We must all practice civility by envisioning those outside of our comfort zone as totally human, the way we want to be viewed as totally human. You can't converse honestly and authentically with people you don't believe are equal to you. Cannot do it. Secondly, we need to practice what is called gracism. Christians know that the Word of God says grace is the unmerited favor of God. It's giving us what we don't deserve. And Dr. David Anderson, an author in a book called Gracism, said, racism is attributing negatives and withholding benefits to people solely on race, but gracism, attributes positives and extends benefits to people in spite of their race. Practice, become a gracist. Third, this institution is really, I believe, keenly capable of doing. Develop universal teaching through our religious and educational institutions for children and adults alike on the value to America of diversity and inclusion, emphasizing the unique contribution of every ethnic group. I said to Doug when I first met him that in order to be successful as an African American, I had to get the equivalent of a PhD in whiteology. I had to know everything there is to know about white people, but my white counterparts don't even have to know who Sarah Vaughan is or Bo Diddley. Some of you know. But the idea that I don't have to know Native American or Asian culture to be a full human being, there's something limiting about that. The fourth is reject and deconstruct the notion of superior and inferior humans as offensive to God. Period. 5, African Americans and their white colleagues ought to start building bridges of entrepreneurial collaboration with other countries like India and South America to rebuild distressed Black communities. It's not going to happen in these United States of America. It's not going to happen, but that would be a critical undertaking. 6, this is a dream of mine for a lot of years. I live in a rural community. I have a farm. Most of my neighbors are white. Many of them had Confederate flags before I moved into the neighborhood. They're all gone now. We all have American flags. But I dream of building bridges of collaboration between poor and working class white people and African American people on issues that we commonly hold, like jobs and health care. And finally, realize that before God, we're all sinners in need of grace. And that at the foot of the cross, we all are equal. And it is at that foot of the cross that sets us free to love our neighbors as ourselves. The prophet Micah asked the question that we must ask ourselves today. He says, He has shown you, O people, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you? But to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Barbara, and thanks to all of you for the opportunity of being here with you this week. Dr. Franklin, thank you so much for this invitation. Like Barbara, 10 years ago, I could not have spoken to you on this day. And it was not because I was so angry, it was because I was so uninformed and so unconnected. I'm a Christian minister, and I work out of a Trinitarian Christian framework. There are 3 times in my life when I feel as though I've had an encounter with God which has really affected the trajectory of my life. The first 3 took place in libraries, one in Boston, one in Oxford, one in New York City. But the 4th call, or the 4th encounter, took place at a very strange place to meet God, and that was the Hertz rental car service lot at the O'Hare Airport in January of 2015. I was there to rent a car, obviously. I had gotten there after midnight. It was very cold. And there was a problem with the car that I got. Often if you get there late at night, you'll be upgraded to a better car. And they gave me a luxury car. And I said, I really can't drive that car. It's like, what? You don't want a Lexus? And I said, I'm a fundraiser. That does not help me in this particular call. I need money. And my car should reflect that in some way. But as we were waiting, what should have been a very quick routine change, there was some problem that I didn't understand, and the woman who was helping me did not understand. It was 1 o'clock in the morning in January, a very cold night, out in the parking lot in the O'Hare Airport. And the woman helping me was an African-American woman about my age. She was gracious, she was professional, she was efficient. But I was thinking, why are you here at 1 o'clock in the morning? Why aren't you home with your family where my wife, my sisters would likely be with their families at this time? I thought perhaps she's a grandmother, working 2 jobs. I don't know. I didn't ask those questions. But we enjoyed a conversation, and as we were waiting, and it was obviously taking longer than we had anticipated, there was a television monitored on the yellow brick wall there in the Hertz rental lot. And there was a story of a young black man who was in trouble in Chicago. Armed robbery. I'm not sure if there was a shooting or not. But it was awkward to be across the counter from this woman. I was hoping it would go to commercial break after that story, but it went to another story of a young black man in Chicago in difficulty, and then to a third story. So it was unavoidable. So when it finally did go to commercial, we're just a couple of feet apart across the counter. And then I made eye contact with her, and I said, "How does that make you feel?" She said, "Hopeless." She had said, "I used to have hope, but I'm beginning to lose hope." I believe in the power of hope, the relentless power of hope. The Apostle Paul said, "Now these 3 remain, faith, hope, and love, and the greatest is love." But hope is a very powerful force. For people who have hope, they can continue no matter how great the odds. But people who lose hope do bad things to themselves and bad things to other people. Now, a few months later, as I was thinking, I couldn't help but think about this woman and about her children and grandchildren and what it might mean to be losing hope. A few months later, my wife and I were in Oxford, England, celebrating our 40th anniversary when the news came on, and we saw the news about what had happened at Mother Emanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina. Like many of you, that was devastating news. After hearing almost every month another unprovoked shooting of a young black man, now to have a white man go into a church on a Wednesday night for prayer meeting and sit with people for an hour for a Bible study and a prayer time, and then to open fire upon them and to kill the pastor and 8 parishioners, that was just devastating. A couple of days later, I read an article by Joshua Dubois, President Obama's spiritual advisor. Every morning for 6 years, he texted devotionals to the president. Joshua had written an article in the Daily Beast in which he said, in a sense, I don't know what to do, I don't know what to say, talking about the fact that in my country, in 2015, this would happen in a church. And then he said, we need people in the majority culture, white Christians, who have the courage to help drive the dialogue in search of some answers. And as I read that, I thought, I fit that description. I'm a member of the majority culture. I'm a white Christian. When I was a boy and there would be terrible things happening, I would think, why doesn't somebody do something? Well, now I'm in a position to do something. Well, a couple of days later, I called Joshua and a pastor friend, Claude Alexander, in Charlotte, North Carolina, and a businessman in Washington, D.C., Dale Jones. We were all friends, and I said, what can we do? Well, a couple of days later, we had a conference call with 60 leaders who represented the black church and the white church, as well as a couple of Latinos and Asian Americans on a conference call. Barbara was on that call. This was the first time we met. Dr. Franklin was on that call as well. Dr. Skinner, William Skinner, Dr. Franklin were both on the call. And we decided, like scholars and ministers, that we should produce a document, a letter. We began writing, and a few days later, we had a letter ready to release to the Washington Post. Then Dr. Franklin called me on Thursday afternoon, and he said, Doug, we really like the letter. We think it's very well written. We've written it together. We're happy to sign it. But we have one reservation. Most of us, speaking on behalf of the African Americans, do not know most of the white signatories. And we're concerned that many of them do not know us. He said, would you be willing to put the letter aside until such time as we can actually meet face to face and discuss these things? I said, of course. The point was not to write a letter. The point is to solve problems, to search for answers to some of these seemingly intractable problems. So 3 weeks later, 24 of us met at the Thurgood Marshall Center in Washington, D.C. for a Monday afternoon and evening and an all-day Tuesday session. And the first 30 minutes that we were together was a reception before dinner, validated his concern. Because as Barbara and Joshua and African Americans would come in, they would meet each other with a warm hug and often laughter, the joy of being together. As white leaders would come, likewise, they would embrace one another, share greetings. But all too often, I observed that when whites and blacks would meet, they would extend their hand politely and say, "Your name is?" "From?" And I thought, this is almost incomprehensible. This is the varsity, right? This was the A-team from both the black community and the white community, and in many cases, they did not even know each other. Well, we had a great time together, a profoundly impactful time together. And we often talked in terms of apprenticing ourselves as white leaders. What does it mean to apprentice ourselves to the black community? What does it mean for them to be the teachers and for us to be the learners? For more than 20 years, my wife and I were missionaries in Japan. The first order of business was to learn the language. We're staying over here in Mission Hall. I don't know how many missionaries are there right now, but for any of you who have ever been missionaries or have supported missionaries or prayed for missionaries, you know that you really are not very effective until you've learned the language. That requires perseverance, dedication, humility. And if any of you have young missionaries who are in such a position, pray for them. I remember my first year in Japan, one day on the way to the train station to then go downtown Tokyo to language school. All-day affair, every day for the first year and half days for the second year. And as I was making slow progress in that language, I was reminded of the words of St. Francis Xavier, who wrote back he was the first missionary to Japan in 1549, wrote back to some of his friends in Paris and said, "Japanese is the most difficult language encountered yet." He'd traveled and worked all over Asia. He said, "I believe it is a tool of Satan to thwart the cause of the gospel." Every missionary in Japan knows that quote. Well, as I was walking along, I saw an old Japanese woman in a kimono. This is 1980. And she was giving her dog a tongue lashing. And the dog has its ears down and its tail between its legs. And I thought, isn't this pathetic? As I walked along, I thought, here I am. I'm a man. I'm educated at Wheaton College, at Gordon Conwell Seminary, at Harvard University. And here's a dog. And the dog understood everything that was being said, and I didn't catch a word. I thought I was prepared to work child level, but here I'm working sub-dog level in a new culture. And it so happens my name is Doug, and I was often called Dog, to be reminded of my place in the culture. Actually, it's a great experience. And my wife, Barbara, you'd be pleased to know, is committed to getting a PhD in Blackology. Since your quote, she reads all the time. And I want to commend one documentary to you if you have not seen it, 13th. It's the story of the 13th Amendment. It's really the intersection of race, justice, and mass incarceration. You really must watch it. There are books that you can find to further educate yourself on these matters. But after our time in Washington, D.C., we realized what a gap there was. And so we began having consultations, actually simply bringing together black leaders and white leaders in places like Los Angeles, Chicago, St. Louis, Detroit, Dallas, Boston, Washington, D.C., and so on. And you know what the number one key is? This morning, I was at the lecture by the young environmentalist from the National Geographic Society. He was brilliant and winsome, and I realized he's an evangelist. He's saying there's something that all of you can do. Well, I'm also a missionary evangelist, and there is something that all of you can do. Mark Whitlock is the pastor of Christ Our Redeemer, AME Church, in Irvine, California. And after our gathering in Washington, D.C., the Thurgood Marshall Center, he was invited by a white pastor to have dinner in their home. Mark said, I had been a pastor, a senior minister at an AME church in Irvine for 18 years before I was invited to the home of a white family. And it was a white minister. And then I asked myself, when was the last time we had a black minister in our family? I know that having been a missionary in Japan, it was much easier to spend an evening with fellow Westerners, Europeans, Americans, with whom there's a common language and history. It took effort to be speaking Japanese in a way that was meaningful, but it was also an investment in another culture. So the thing that all of you can do as scholars, as pastors, as business leaders, the professions in which you are involved, is intentionally cultivate a friendship with an African American family. When we were in Japan, the highest honor was not only to be invited into a Japanese home, but to be invited to go to their ancestral village at holiday time. And so to have someone in your home at Thanksgiving or Christmas, a special occasion, that is a great gift. And there's a natural curiosity of how do black people do this? How do white people do this? Because we haven't been in one of their homes. That is a great gift. And when you are in communities of people where there is misunderstanding, no matter what, if you know that there are peace talks going on, that the leaders of the families, the towns, the clubs, whatever, are talking, it gives people a sense of hope. When we were in Washington, D.C., Joshua Dubois, who was so prominent in that original gathering and is such a capable younger leader, his wife, Michelle, was expecting their first child. And every time that his phone rang, we thought it might be Michelle, and all of us held our breath, hoping that we would get the news that the baby was on its way. The little August did not come until 2 weeks later. But I think about August, and I think about the woman in the Hertz car lot, and I think about my own children, and their children, and their children. We are committed to building a more civil and cohesive society. I believe in the story of the Tower of Babel that separated us. I also believe in the hope of Pentecost that brought us together. And I believe in the eschatological vision that someday, from every language, nation, tribe, and tongue, as far as you can see, we'll all be together giving praise to God. It is my hope that we experience a part of that in our life now. And I think that one of the greatest gifts that we can give is in the gift of friendship and in hospitality. Too oftentimes we see the other either as a threat or as a commodity. Jesus said, I no longer call you servants, I call you my friends. And when the other becomes friend by the first name basis, God gives you something wonderful. And Barbara, I would want to say that all friendships take work, every relationship. And our friendship was tested after Trump was elected president. Because for those of us who are white people, and for a person like myself who's a progressive evangelical, I didn't add the word progressive until the word got co-opted to be a conservative, angry voting bloc. But all of a sudden, there was extra tension on the relationship. What does it mean for us to wait patiently until it's time to talk again? Because January was too soon, February was too soon, March was borderline, and now we're talking again. It takes work, but we're committed to this over the long haul. I do believe in the quote of Tocqueville that our nation does have the capacity to bring healing to itself. Our institutions are great. There's still greatness in the character of many of our people. So let's resolve to build bridges. Let's resolve that from many, one continues to be not only the motto of our country, but also the great reality. Thank you.
I would like to pose one question to our leaders this afternoon before we open the floor. Dylan Roof, the young man responsible for this terrible tragedy and massacre at the church in Charleston, was a young man. And I think many of us believed that our education systems, our systems of socializing young people, were helping those young people to become better informed, more tolerant, more thoughtful and respectful of others. That represented a kind of breach, a surprise, a shock. And so I want to pose the question to each of you just briefly before we open the floor. As you think about the next generation, those who are in the pipeline, heading into college and university or high school students, as you look abroad, you both travel nationally and internationally, what gives you hope and what worries you most about the next generation?
Thank you. What gives me hope is looking into the eyes of my grandchildren and seeing a better future and working. And then it encourages me, even though I may not be into that future, it encourages me to work hard right now for that. So it encouraged me to be with Doug. Even though it was difficult, I actually didn't want to talk to him anymore again, ever, after the election. But we got over it. But it's my children and especially the grandchildren, and they don't see what I see. They didn't go through what we went through. So their friends are different. Their friendships look like a little UN, and that gives me hope.
Thank you, Barbara, for getting over it. In terms of the anger towards me and towards white people because of what happened. And we must resolve to call ourselves, be our best selves. In terms of what gives me hope, at 2:01, just as we sat down, I got a text. And let me just read it to you. It's from James Brown. Hey, boss, are you free to talk? And I had to send him a note, not right now. But James Brown is a young African-American from Troy, Alabama, that I met at a student conference in Birmingham. And he came up afterwards, after the second or third session, and said, would you mentor me? And so he's, in a sense, he's Exhibit A. There are two other African-American young men, one in Atlanta and one in LA, that I'm also involved in a wonderful relationship. And they give me hope because of the fact that they are all people who very easily could be statistics. But they are showing great progress. And they would say to me, and I would say to you, white privilege is real. And those people would say, we have to work 10 times as hard to get to the same place that you might be. My daughter is a PhD student at Princeton, and she has an African-American roommate who's a graduate of MIT, who was told both by a professor and by another student, you don't belong here. She transferred to Columbia. In Boston recently, at Fenway Park, another major league team was in town, and racial epithets were hurled at a black player. And others said Boston is the most racist major league town in the major leagues, baseball town in the major leagues. So this is not a Southern problem. This is really a global phenomenon, racism is. But what gives me hope? I want to just read a quote from another person. This is Mark Laberton, who's the president of Fuller Seminary in Pasadena, California. This was in response to a letter that I sent out to many of our Civilitas colleagues, and with it I sent a letter that Barbara had published in the Huffington Post. And there was this sense of frustration that we shared, that whites seemingly have gone silent. But many people, including the president of Wheaton College, a leading evangelical institution in Chicago, Fuller Seminary, University Christian Fellowship, John Ortberg, the pastor of Menlo Park Presbyterian Church out in the Bay Area, all wrote back talking about things that they are doing. This is what Mark Laberton wrote. Fuller has on the front steps of our central building all school year a memorial to many of the black lives lost in this academic year. We have used it regularly as a centerpiece around which we have gathered to remember, grieve, lament, speak out, and demonstrate. It has been incorporated in chapels, conferences, and seminars, and it has put before us as a community the ongoing daily narrative of racial violence by police and others against the bodies of black people, especially younger black men. And then he writes this, as I write and speak about often, the greatest crisis revealed by the election and post-election reality we live in is the exposure of the white American church's participation in and identification with racism. This has been historically true is an unlamented fact, and that it is and will define our future seems to be unquestionable. Disillusionment with the church and Christian faith has many elements, but this fundamental inconsistency to demonstrate that we are living out the faith we proclaim must be high on the list of causes. And he signs his letter in despair and hope. It's interesting, it's those two elements that we live with. So I guess perhaps my greatest hope is that there are people like Mark Laberton and many others who are taking it seriously, their responsibility to educate themselves. And I guess my greatest sorrow is the fact that so many fellow Christians seem to be living out more of a white, religious, nationalistic folk religion than the true Christian faith. And I think another fundamental problem, thank you, I can't say that everywhere I go with that kind of a response, including my own family reunion. And with that, I just lost my train of thought. So in closing.
Okay, we're down to...
Let's thank Barbara Williams-Skinner and Doug Birdsall. open the floor, and those of you who wish to pose a question or offer a brief response to the matter of, gather at the microphones on either side of the podium, and we'll acknowledge you in alternating order. Your hopes, your greatest fears for our future. And with that, we'll begin here.
Great question.
If you have a specific speaker you wish to address it to, or more generally, please.
Oh, you've never known me to do anything.
No.
Blurt out to everybody. So it's related to the hope and the worry. I'm working with a group of first graders now in an after-school program, predominantly Americans of African descent. The little 7-year-old, as we're working on the Black History Month packet, I read to her George Washington Carver, born in 1864, the son of slaves, at which point the 7-year-old pointed her finger at me about 2 inches from my nose and said, "And you controlled all of them." I said, well, maybe let's do the picture of Martin Luther King Jr., and no, I'm not 160 years old. So the despair would be that someone as young as 7, regardless of what I might have been teaching at the time or what group, but that a 7-year-old in America is being inculcated by somebody or some institution with a lack of recognition that we're all humans and we're just all in it together. Now, the hope that comes from that is by the end of the school year, Alyssa and I were great friends, and she hopefully understands that just because I'm pretty pale doesn't mean that I'm to be despised or afraid of. And my question is, and you probably will be able to predict it, how do we get our language, our communal language, to reflect that we are one human race? There are not races, but one. It's humanity. Our ethnicities may differ, our eye color and skin may differ, but how do you feel about all the vocabulary about us?
The vocabulary. Well, the vocabulary comes from your thoughts. A repeated thought becomes an action. A repeated action becomes a habit. And then habits build a certain character, right? So if I want to change my behavior, I got to change my thoughts. I can't work on my behavior. So if I don't think others are equal, and it doesn't bear witness in my surroundings, I'm just talking. For example, I'm a Super Bowl nut. You know, I love football. Okay, so this is the first Super Bowl. 2 Super Bowls ago, I was convicted that all my guests were African Americans. There's nothing wrong with that. We all hated the Patriots together, okay? So, I'm sorry.
Things were going so well.
I'm sorry, we hated them. I'm sorry, Doug, I have to confess. Anyway, we're still bridging. We're a work in progress. So, but last 2 years ago, the Lord convicted me that I needed to bear witness to what I was thinking. So I'm living in a neighborhood of mostly white, rural people, so I invited some neighbors over. This is the first time they've ever been in my home. We had a great time together. My guests, black and white, had an amazing time. There were no fights, even though Atlanta people wanted to have a fight. But you've got to connect your behavior with your thoughts. And the question is, who's in your company? Who's in your children's wedding? Who's in the reception? Who's in the barbecue? Otherwise, it's just talk.
Thank you. Very good question. Just one thing, and this has to do with culture. The Western culture, white culture, which white is a relatively American concept because we all melted together. We were Italians and English and Germans and so on, and then whiteness became distinctive as vis-a-vis blackness. But our culture tends to be very individualistic. I would say African American culture is much more communal. And so for a white person, as an individualist, if I am not currently in a relationship with a black person who I despise, I'm not racist. And so I'm not responsible for any of this. But as a white person, I realize that I benefit from white privilege. And so though I was not a slaveholder, there is a system that persists, which is unequal and unjust. And so to be fully human, which I think actually embraces our various histories and languages that are special to us but need to be seen in the larger context. So I think that it's a both and. And so I think that I would say that I do have a responsibility for what happened 160 years ago, and I want to make sure that that little girl, 7 years old, grows up with a sense of dignity and being respected by her teacher, and I'm sensing you're communicating that to her. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, please.
Thank you. After the election, there was a lot of analysis of working class white people who seemingly were very anxious and seemingly were very much threatened by the fact that women and blacks and even Latinos and immigrants were rising in status and sort of threatening the status that they had built up in their minds that they had because they were white. Now, they were described as people who are very anxious about the future and not having much hope. So my question is, how do you reach those people and give them some hope?
Yeah.
Sure, yeah.
Thank you. Your name?
Fred Livingstone from Cleveland, Ohio.
Okay, thank you, Fred. Very good question, and it touches on a very important issue, and I think Barbara and I can speak to this, so come on up, because we both think about this.
Right.
The Democrats missed it big time when they didn't listen to Bill Clinton and saying, don't ignore small town, in particular, white people.
Okay.
For the first time in American history, whites feel vulnerable. Blacks have always been vulnerable. Italians felt vulnerable. Irish, Catholics, Jews. But white people are now feeling vulnerable. And that's where the Republicans bypass people like Jeb Bush and John Kasich and all these other people for a person like Trump, who somehow or another spoke to their fears, even though it didn't, in my sense, in my thinking, make much sense. There wasn't much logic to it, but it's like, I alone understand the problem and I alone can fix it. I've never met a person like that before. But I do realize, and having just been in a family reunion in Indiana 2 days ago with my cousins, some of whom still live in small towns in Michigan and Illinois that are suffering terribly, I understand why they resent my Eastern elitism. And I'm trying to find ways that we can have conversations where we're talking. My son, who worked at the State Department, went to Cambridge and did a PhD, wanted to return to the State Department. He was told, you're the leading white candidate, which means you probably won't be hired. Now, because he's benefited so much, there are other things that he has other options. But I think this is a reality. It's an emotional reality, perhaps even more than an economic reality, but it's all of these things. So you asked the question, how to? I've just agreed with your premise. Now, could you answer the question, Barbara?
How to? The how-to is really uncomplicated. People are not afraid of people they know. You're not afraid of people whose birthdays and anniversaries you know, whose children and grandchildren you know by name. You're not afraid of those people. You're afraid of categories that you have nothing to do with. So we've had to, my neighbors, look, I have a 35-acre farm, lawn tractor, mine breaks, I use theirs, they use mine, we know each other, we're connected. So we've got to get connected in the same way. The us and them language has got to stop. It's just got to stop. And you and I can do that right now. I'm telling my African-American friends, we need to start building bridges with rural whites around health care, around jobs. And I think we can just start, but it starts with our language. Second, it starts realizing that you don't have to be black to have a problem. Okay, so if somebody is poor and they're white, they got a problem. As a decision maker, I've got to deal with that. And I can't call them racist because they have a problem. So I think it's a matter of, again, full humanity, respecting the humanness, hearing the heart, hear the problem, build the bridge.
Beautiful. Thank you.
When I hear people say, don't blame me for slavery, I'm not that old, or don't blame me for redlining because I didn't get involved in it, or don't blame me for white privilege because I don't know what that means. I'm reminded of the 70s with the feminist movement, with consciousness raising among women who taught me how I could be sexist without realizing it, without knowing it. And I think the issue for many of us is that we don't see the implicit racism that's built in to our institutions, and even those from the past, how it's affected us. Right. If more people understood, if I understood, to be honest, better, how did slavery 160 years ago impact now? How did the redlining, I understand that a little bit, impact on black families? And I don't know if there is a source, a particular source. He has it, good. If you don't have it, he has it. A particular source where I could learn specifically from the viewpoint of minorities, what is white privilege, how does it play out?
I didn't really like the term white privilege when I first heard it because it sounded too much like white supremacy or something that I had done intentionally to elevate myself. But I'm going to just tell a real quick story about Charles Dorsey, who's from Compton, California. Single mother, very few opportunities in his neighborhood. By the time he graduated from high school, 10 of his peers had been murdered. Charles graduated from USC, then Claremont, then did a PhD at Pepperdine. Married to a young attorney. He was driving down the 405 freeway in their new SUV on a Saturday night when he got pulled over by the police. And the policeman did not get out of the car until a second car arrived. And then when the policeman came and knocked on his window, there was a second policeman behind him with a gun pulled. And they asked for his driver's license. He went to reach for his billfold, and in the tension of the moment, he dropped it. And then he said, I guess you don't want me reaching for that, do you? And he put his hands out the window because he knew this could end very badly. They put him against the car, and then he said, I'm Charles. He'd been hired by the Orange County Police Department to actually do training for officers in how to handle black men. This is a case of driving while black. And every black man that I know knows that experience. I tell the story of about the same time I got stopped in Chicago on a Saturday night by the policeman. I was coming home from my nephew's wedding, and when I saw the blue lights, my first thought was, oh, shoot, how much is this going to cost me? When he came to the car, he said, you probably wonder why I stopped you. And I said, I guess I was just driving too slow. When blacks hear that, they say, no way, smartass. But the white officer realized I was joking. He said, no. He said, you're talking on your cell phone. And I said to him, since when is Illinois hands-free? And he told me just recently. And he checked my license. Massachusetts, it's not hands-free. He also said, your seatbelt's not fastened. He said, how hard is it to fasten your seatbelt? I said, at my age, it takes a little effort. Again, he realized it's like I'm defenseless. But he checked, and then he gave me a warning and say, drive safe. That's white privilege. I would not have been aware of that 2 years ago had I not experienced so many black. Just one more quick story that illustrates this. A mother in Chicago, an executive in Chicago at one of our sessions talked about her son who was a star cross-country runner. And she and her husband moved into another school district that had a great cross-country program in the hopes, like a lot of us parents, that he would get a scholarship to help with getting into a good school with funding that would come with a scholarship. One night after he had done his homework, in a home where both parents are college graduates, he goes out to run. Cross-country is a fall sport. In Chicago, it was chilly. He had on sweatpants and a sweatshirt with a hood. Now, this young star athlete, star student, is a black kid in a hoodie running down the street. And soon the police are there, and he is nose down on the asphalt. That's black disadvantage. Now, I feel a responsibility to do something about that. Because that mother, I've been in situations where black friends have asked me for help, And I said, oh, I know a black guy who does. And they said, no, get the white guy. There's a sense in which we work together, because there are times when, and from a scriptural point of view, I need you and you need me. Paul said, bear one another's burdens and thus fulfill the law of Christ, which is, we were designed to be mutually burdensome. And there's a joy in sharing the burdens. So that's where I would say, white folks, we do have responsibility for a system that is unjust, fundamentally. You don't need to feel guilty about it. The point is not to make you feel guilty. The point is to say there's something we can do. And so when it comes to interacting with many of you people who have influence, as you influence city councils, school boards, police departments, there's simply a matter of saying, let's make this fair. I went down, no more stories. Okay, back to you, Barbara.
I'm going to ask our remaining speakers if they just shorten and speed things up so that we can hear as many voices as possible, particularly as we talk about greatest hopes and greatest fears in this time. Mike.
Ms. Williams-Skinner, thank you very much for your introductory comments. You're someone who speaks frankly of what she sees, I'm certain. Your Super Bowl analogy or recitation caused me to change what my question is. And as you stood there and you saw this audience, it probably looked just like your Super Bowl party in reverse.
Yes,
And recognizing that
but the food was at my place better.
we're going to have you come on over to our place for dinner tonight. Seriously. I better check with my wife first, though. Seriously, as you look out here and recognizing you don't want to be rude to your hosts at all, give us a little bit of frankness. You've been here, you've spoken to a few folks. What should we be doing in Chautauqua other than just talking among ourselves and recognizing that there's been a lot of good faith efforts over the last, at least, certainly over the last couple of years and over the last decade, but they haven't worked. What should we be doing?
Okay, I'll be very brief. You gotta look different. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm going all out of my comfort zone. My prayer partner's white, my lawyer's white, my hairdresser's Korean. I'm the United Nations by myself. So you got to your life has just got to look different. And everybody here is either going to intellectually say, oh, that was a nice talk, and go back. Or my prayer is that you'll say, there's one thing I can do. I can build a relationship with somebody. They don't even have to be black. It can be a non-white person. I'm going to actually go. Now, you can't go, just say, can I be your friend? You're Asian, okay? You don't. They've done that to me. Don't do that. And don't go online looking, I start with asking God to show me. Just a quick story. I knew that I had a problem with Southern white women. That was my problem because of the lynchings, 5,000 of African Americans. It's just a real problem, even after I gave my life to Jesus Christ. So I prayed and asked the Lord for a white sister, that's all I said, that I could bond with, I can become a covenant sister to, spend time with, blah, blah, blah. Okay. So you've got to be careful what you pray. Because he sent Rosemary Tribble, the wife of the Virginia senator, former Virginia senator, who was junior league, Arkansas, whatever, very white and very Southern, and Republican. I said, God, what's your second choice? But you gotta step out. You gotta step out. And we've been together for 25 years. Okay, you gotta step out of yourself. Let your fears go. Give them to God. Be transparent. Say, I don't know what I don't know. Look stupid. Yeah, we say stupid things. We had a whole hair thing. We were together one time when we first went to give a speech together in New York, I think it was in Boston, and it was raining, and we were wearing one umbrella and two women, and Rosemary and I had just met. It's the first time we're together, out in public, and she turns to me and she says, you don't need an umbrella. Your hair is not even moving. I said, well, you can take your little white self up there and do this whole speech by yourself. I said, and then when did you get to be an expert in black hair? That was 25 years ago. You got to step out. You got to give God your fear. You got to take a chance on one another.
I'll try to make this very brief. One of the things which gives me great hope is what my church in Westport, Connecticut is doing. We have read Waking Up White by Debbie Irving, because the real issue is we've got to work on our white privilege and figure that out. And for those of you who want to understand white privilege, please Google Tim Wise. You get Tim Wise on white privilege, and it's a starting place, because I have met the enemy and he is me.
Yeah. Oh.
Very good.
Good afternoon. Right now, my greatest source of hope are my friends sitting on the fourth row right behind me. But on the flip side of that, this time last year, I became immersed in the whole history of lynching and the hanging of other Americans. And I started to notice that there were young children that were looking up to those trees, enjoying what they were seeing.
Yeah, it was a circus.
And now, 50 years later, they're parents and they have kids.
Yes.
So, as fine and dandy as Chautauqua is, there's a lot of work to do.
Yes, there is.
And I struggle with maintaining hope at 29 years old. I was a cynic once upon a time ago, but I'm hoping that just one thing, whether it's now or after the lecture, a nice kick in the pants.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
A couple more comments.
If I may, I'll face you all because you're my community for the summer. One Sunday, I walked onto the grounds. I had my gate pass, and it was scanned. One of my friends followed behind me, and her gate pass was scanned. But the gate pass attendant stopped her and said, "Is that her ID? Does that ID belong to her?" I write for the Daily, and the surprise shouldn't be a surprise because we know who our president is. The surprise shouldn't be a surprise because yesterday, Alton Sterling was killed a year ago. Today, Philando Castile was killed. Later this month, Eric Garner was killed, as well as Sandra Bland. And so when we live in a country where we refuse to check our own bias, where we refuse to check our own privilege, where we refuse to think at the very least and examine our own selves, because you can't legislate behavior. You can't legislate how you feel. Even changing the textbooks would start the process, but it wouldn't fix how we feel in our hearts. It wouldn't keep those questions, the fact that in 2017, and I shouldn't have to say that I went to Northwestern, I shouldn't have to say that I'm getting a graduate degree from UC Berkeley, I shouldn't have to name any of the accolades to justify my humanity, because her question, if that ID belonged to me, was a question of, do I belong here at Chautauqua? And that is the reality of this community. Whether or not, I'm not expecting anybody to admit it. I don't want pity from anyone. I don't want condolences, because at this point I really want us to think about critically about how we can do less talking, more doing, more changing, more shifting, so that aside from not being questioned for being on these grounds about who I am, at the very least we can start to work to wrestle with ourselves. Like President Hill even talked about going through an honest struggle, wrestling with yourself, and I think that we need to continue to do that here.
Mm-hmm.
We'll ask no others to stand. Let's hear from these four commentators, and then we'll allow Doug and Barbara to offer some closing comments.
Well, thank you for the important conversation we're having today. I'm just wondering if we're oversimplifying the issue by making it a black-white, a white-brown, a white-yellow issue when we have cross-cutting issues of culture, subculture, and class, and that there are tremendous differences within any individual race in terms of class. I think the excellent book, J.D. Vance's Hillbilly Elegy, is an example of how we, in white society, have groups that we don't talk to and we don't understand. It doesn't have to do with race. It has completely to do with culture and subculture and class. So I think that needs to be part of the equation to really get at the root causes of the things that we're talking about here today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, just quickly, I thought about many of the ways that I could respond to Dr. Franklin's challenge to us to find those areas in our own towns that we feel most exemplify the worries about racial equality and those that exemplify hope. And I gave up on that as I've listened to these wonderful questions coming up. And the gal who spoke just a couple before me, the experience that she had entering our grounds tells me, and what I'd like to just leave and share today, is that Chautauqua must start doing more to bring in other ethnic groups, other peoples, different colors. I started coming here almost 10 years ago, and I was struck, as someone who has always lived in highly integrated communities, by how white we are. And here we are almost 10 years later, and it's no better. And I'm going to write to our new president that I want there to be more outreach, more whatever it takes. I mean, marketing, get the word out. Really, Dr. Franklin, your department could be working on this. I mean, we've got to start changing the ethnic makeup of Chautauqua. So that's one comment. And the final one, I just have to share with you the main thing that gives me hope. I've quit watching the news. I don't allow 45 in my life as much as I can avoid it. What I hang on to is Martin Luther King Jr.'s quote, "I believe that unarmed truth and unconditional love will have the final word in reality. That is why the right, temporarily defeated, is stronger than evil triumphant."
Mm-hmm.
I want to thank you for your kind words, for your thoughts, and it helped to crystallize for me what I'm doing in my little corner of God's universe, which I serve a parish right outside of Philadelphia, primarily white congregation. They are just a fantastic congregation. They are really good, I like to say, at collecting stuff. So if you need, if the call comes out that you need beds or you need school supplies or food, we're good. When we started to try to put together a relationship with an African American congregation in Philadelphia, they were all about it. They invited us into their house. Fear. So they said, can't we just send a check? I said, well, why don't we deliver a check? So I think what you're saying, that is what gives me hope, is the desire to build these relationships. What gives me pause is how difficult it is to do that. So thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. We need this so desperately. I work extensively with inner city children and pick them up for Sunday school. And I had no idea that in my car I had two warring families. We were talking about the two great commandments, love your neighbor as yourself, and one little girl who is extremely indigent, she wanted to get a gift for her mother for her birthday, and the other family, for whatever reason, broke out in this anger. We couldn't understand it, but pretty soon we had a war going in our Sunday school. We had to get the pastor. I mean, I thought they were going to hit each other. So when we went home, I talked with the grandmother. She said, oh, yes, when those kids are out there, I don't allow my children out there. Well, she tried. I said, we're going to pray. We're going to have a healing in this neighborhood. But 2 weeks later, she had to call the police. So we kept praying, and there's been a healing. What I don't understand, I'm from Cincinnati. We've had riots. I'll be ended right now. What is it that's causing the warring between the black against the black? I mean, I'm not sure what to do.
That's a separate lecture. Please.
So we're going to ask, as we wrap up our program, and we've done some heavy lifting today, and we have two extraordinary leaders who are leading hopeful efforts throughout this nation. Barbara and Doug, if you would come now, and just closing 90 seconds each.
He can't, I'll try. God so loved the world that he sent a check. Right. He sent Jesus. We have to go ourselves. We have to get out of our comfort zones. I left a black church, which I dearly love, and I still work closely with, and I'm in a multicultural church. The music is not my music. I still miss the Gospels, blah, blah, blah. But I want to be true to God. Thank you.
We often use the phrase, I didn't like him until I met him. And I think that's the great joy in sending a check plus building a relationship is the return that you get on that investment. You've heard the statement that the joy that we experience upon arriving at our destination is in direct proportion to the difficulty we have in getting there. And so when you're at a graduation and you see tears streaming down the eyes of a mother, you realize how much that mother may have sacrificed, mother or father, for that young woman or that young man to receive that diploma. And so likewise, when we see one person experiencing the hope that we may have because of the hope that we shared, it is worth it all. We also believe that we are made in the image of God, Imago Dei, we say. And so when I see Barbara, I realize that this is a person that God created. And when he created, he said, and this is very good. Every feature, your beautiful hair, smile, the color of your skin, that's the work of God. And I can remember being at a gathering after the election and before the inauguration when Tony Campolo prayed, Lord, help me to see the image of God in Donald Trump. And people didn't laugh. They realized it wasn't a joke. This is hard work. So let's, for the one person, I mean, when I get this text from James Brown, as soon as I'm done, I'm going to call James. Because James is a young person who, after he'd finished college, couldn't find a job in Birmingham. I called white friends who own businesses, and I said, this guy needs your help. And now James has a job. One person didn't change the unemployment or employment statistics, but it's made a difference in James's life. All of us have the ability to be bridge builders and difference makers. May God turn our will into desire, and may that desire know determination until the job is done. Thank you.